So I'll just keep talking about the history of slackline videos a little bit. Highline California is kind of an epic slackline movie, and this is when people started to realize that slacklining was more than just, music and slackline tricks. There was some value to telling the story behind slacklining, and Highline California really did that, where there was all these old school slackliners like Jerry and Julian DeForge told the story of sending the Lost Arrow Spire and all these other epic highlands in Yosemite, and it was a little bit of hybrid of music and slacklining, but also, some storytelling.
Yeah, I remember watching it. It's one of the first long videos that really ever came out around slacklining. I mean, I think it's like a 50-minute long documentary about all these different highlights that they did in California. And before that, there was really no effort put into like long edits for slacklining. So that was a huge, a huge thing to put together at that time before anyone else was doing it. It sounds like our sound is good now, so glad we fixed it.
Awesome. So we're back and I think this is the film that really brought us into the kind of the modern slackline filmmaking era. It was Sketchy Andy, the real rock film, and I think it came out in 2013. But this was really a high quality documentary about Andy and all the crazy stuff he does, and most of it revolved around slacklining. There was a little bit of base jumping, but this is the first time when I think the general public really started to see slacklining, and it was because someone took the time and effort to tell Andy's story.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was doing tons of projects around that time, and like you said, the reason filming is so important is if he hadn't put together any of those edits, no one would have been stoked by it or motivated to kind of go do the same thing, and he would have just kind of been this unknown character. But he was really good at putting all that information into a video. I remember watching that movie specifically, the 24-hour Slack Life Diet, like 100 times. I've watched it before I go slackline. I watched it before I went trickline. So many times.
Totally. And then there are all these really creative things, and I'll jump through these a little faster. But throughout as slacklining and filmmaking developed together, the quality of the videos around trickline competitions really improved. This is a great video, the 2016 GoPro Mountain Games highlight reel showing some of the best trickliners in the world. And then Jan and Tori from Estonia came out with this video called Forest Beasts. And this is kind of the turning point, in 2016, when people decided you couldn't just, pull out your iPhone and make a slackline video anymore. People started to put real effort into telling the story and making something really creative. And along with that, these really beautiful stories started to be told, where the Slacktivity team and Sam started to tell stories about the Highline world records that they were setting, and this movie Onside or Die has got to be one of the most inspiring videos that many slackliners had ever seen. And the beauty behind all of this is people would see these videos and be inspired to go out and do their own massive projects, and so that's kind of how they're correlated, and filmmaking really pulls the community together and pushes progression.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember with other sports too, that when I was into snowboarding or skateboarding, that before I would go do that, it was like a ritual of mine to like watch one of my favorite films. So that's kind of the era that we're in now, that slackliners have all these cool things that they can go find and they can watch before they go do their own big projects, and kind of see what the world as a whole is doing and working on. And that's huge for stoke and motivation and for people trying to make new things happen.
Definitely. Now, and then one more quick one to mention before we move on from the history of slacklining and filmmaking. Untethered. Of course, you can't talk about slacklining and filmmaking without talking about that. I mean, I think there were millions of people who saw this documentary about Spencer Seabrook setting the free solo world record, and I think it definitely inspired me to make more, to tell more stories in slacklining, and I think it inspired a lot of other filmmakers as well.
And it was sort of that next step in quality of filmmaking, where it was not just like a 3-minute edit with, no narrative and some cool shots. It had narrative and it had a story, and it kept you involved for the whole documentary, and told like a really important story in the history of slacklining, which was, Spencer breaking this world record.
Totally. So I'm gonna bring it back here. Marcus and I are gonna start talking about a little bit of our recent projects. So I started off as a slackliner in 2010, and I would make little slackline videos in my backyard, And my first slackline video ever is actually up right here. It's called Slackline Range Session, where I think I had the cheapest camera you could get at the time. And it looks like it was definitely filmed with a toaster or a potato or something. And I did a few jumps and hops. But as my slacklining skills developed, my filming skills developed along with them, and I think that's the case for a lot of slackliners too. And I started making these little edits, and 720 everything was kind of my first video that I wouldn't say blew up, but it got like 15,000 views, so people were watching it. And I started to recognize that instead of just making slackline videos with music, people wanted to hear a little bit of the story behind things. And so that's when I started producing this movie Tension that came out last year, that really combined two different disciplines of slacklining and tricklining and freestyle highlining, and told a little bit of the story behind how you get to kind of an expert point at both of those sports. And then finally, of course, Lines Without Limits just came out a couple weeks ago, and that's Marcus and I's new project that took that next step in combining as many different disciplines of slacklining as we could into one film, and telling the story of the community as a whole and slacklining as a whole. So I'll bring it back here. And
I think that had I just from talking to different people that saw that movie and sharing it with my friends and family and even people outside of the slackline world, I think it had a good impact and sort of did what we wanted it to do, or did what you wanted it to do, which was share the story of slacklining and show all these different facets and shapes of what slacklining can look like with a large group of people. And I think that's the whole point of filmmaking, is that eventually the more that you make and the more that people create, they have a better image to show and to share with other people, and you can get more people involved, and more people can sort of share the love that we have for slacklining.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And the Lines Without Limits idea really comes from other sports, in that it has all these segments, and there are different sections of the movie, and it really ties the whole thing together like a ski movie would, with all disciplines of skiing. But it's also an effort to combine all the slackline films that we'd seen over the years, like the trickline edits and the highline documentaries. We wanted all of that to be encompassed in one film, and so we tried to do our best to do that. But yeah,
and hopefully it gets more people stoked on their own project, and they can take the steps necessary for them to learn about filming and what's important and what gear to use, and they can go make their own films and share their own projects. That's kind of the whole point of us sharing this project.
Yeah, so an important thing we need to talk about there is there's this new trend on certain media platforms. When you think about Instagram and TikTok, there's this new trend for media to be really quick and attention grabbing, where the best video, the videos that's going to succeed on those platforms, is going to be 15 seconds long and extremely entertaining for 15 seconds, because that's what's going to catch people's eye. And I think that Lines Without Limits, in a way, was a little bit of a protest of this kind of media platform, because we wanted to provide more value in a Slackline video, in a Slackline movie, than you would get out of just an Instagram clip. I always say that I'd rather have 10,000 Slackliners watch something and be really impacted by it than have one of my Instagram clips go viral and get 1,000,000 views, because people are going to forget about that after a second, but Slackliners will remember, even if only a few hundred people or 5,000 people watch it, they're going to remember a video that you've put a lot of work and effort into.
Yeah, way more than that 15-second clip, sure.
Yeah.
So I think that brings us kind of to that next question, which is, if you want to make those videos, you're not going to just film with your iPhone. What's necessary? What are the next steps that people need to take to get there?
Totally. So if you're a filmmaker, there in slacklining in particular, there are kind of a few ways to tell your story, or to approach making a video. And I think within that, there are a few different types of slackline films that we can talk about. And those are, documentary style, where you're telling a story via, people talking about something and a bunch of action shots. And that's a great way to tell a story. I think we kind of utilize that technique a lot in Lines Without Limits, where we jump between narrators and shots of slacklining. And then there are also what we call the edits in slacklining that are really just videos and music. It creates a vibe. And so that's another kind of style of how to make a slackline video. And you'll see a lot of trickliners do that, they'll just like choose a rap or a rock song and then they'll just bang out some tricks for 3 minutes.
Yeah, it's all about the connection to the music, and maybe one spot or two spots that they are making that vibe around, and they have some clips of them setting the line up, and then it's almost completely tricks on that one line, kind of almost as if they did it in that one day.
Totally. The edit really creates a feeling, a feeling of like hype. And then there's a hybrid kind of the documentary style and the edit style video. And that's what Lines Without Limits is. You think about the freestyle highline segment in Lines Without Limits, and it's pretty much just music and slackline tricks for 4 or 5 minutes. But then it jumps back into the story of, okay, how did we get here, and how is this tied into slacklining, and how is this tied into the other disciplines? So there's a way to hybrid. And then, of course, it's important to be able to share your knowledge in the form of tutorials and slackline science videos. That's how the How Not to Highline channel kind of works. And so those are parts of filmmaking too, where you're just sharing pieces of knowledge that other people might not know, and that's definitely part of the process.
The educational side of the process, where you're not really worried about the artistic elements as much as you are just about getting out all that information through photojournalism or video journalism.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess that's a good way to distinguish. There's an artistic side where you're putting out slackline media that's designed to just be entertaining, and there's an educational side where you're putting out tutorials and Slack sciencey stuff. So let's talk about how to make a good slackline video. And I guess when we talk about this, we're definitely focusing more on the artistic side of, like, if you want to tell a story and put together kind of a beautiful piece of art that's designed to be watched and entertain people. And I think the first step is, and I know a lot of people don't do this, but storyboard. Write out your idea ahead of time. Say, like, what is the story that I'm trying to tell? What is my niche? Am I a trickliner? Am I trying to tell a story about tricklining? Am I establishing a new highline? And then storyboarding is the process of just writing what the video is going to be like from beginning to end. And I think this is
it's sort of a piece of the visualization process. Like, you kind of have a vision in your mind of what you want to create, and then before you go film, it's very productive to write down a little bit of what the film is going to look like. If you do that, if you have some of those visualization tools like a storyboard, then when you're filming, you're far more efficient with your filming. You're not just filming 100 random things, you're filming for sequencing. So you're thinking, right now I'm filming this section, and then I'm going to have, a quick transition film, and then I'm going to have another transition, and then I'm filming the next section. And that storyboard helps you have a better idea of what that vision of your end product's going to look like versus just going out and filming some slacklining.
For sure. And that's not to say that you can't stray from the storyboard once you start shooting. You have to be flexible, of course, and like the story's going to change when you're out projecting and your line gets struck by lightning all of a sudden. Okay, the video's changed. But it's good to have a little bit of a structure and concept in mind, so you can go in and at least kind of know the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, and it helps with that sequencing. Like, you can add in a sequence, like you said, if something changes. But if you don't have any vision to start with, you're going to kind of end up with a hodgepodge of clips that when you're piecing it together is not going to have a nice flow. So that storyboard and that vision and that creative process beforehand then makes the sequencing while you're filming and while you're editing much more streamlined. And that's super important for having kind of a coherent video.
Totally. So once you've asked yourself, kind of, why am I making this video? What is the story that I have to share with the Slackline community? And what effect do I want it to have overall? Do I want it to just inspire people to go out and slackline? Do I want to, just tell the story about a new project? Whatever it is. Once you've done that, then it's time to go out and shoot. And so there are the actual process of shooting should be like relatively easy if you've kind of storyboarded what the video is going to look like. And in my mind, I always separate the shooting into two different things. It's like the action shots, or like the A-roll, and the A-roll is the beautiful shots of slacklining, the interviews, things like that, the tricks, and then the B-roll. And the B-roll is what gives context to your story. The B-roll is like the establishing shots of the scenery where you are, a shot of hiking up to the spot, trees, whatever. And a good way to think about B-roll is the 1, 2, 3, I like to call it. The tight, medium, and the wide. And so shots like super up close of trees are good for giving a little bit of context of where you are. And then the medium is good for, subjects walking through a forest or whatever. And then a wide would be like maybe a drone shot that's showing the whole scenery.
Yeah, totally. And that B-roll, I think if that B-roll is left out, you sort of get something that's a little jumbled and quick, and the B-roll helps stretch out your A-roll, your medium, your media, I should say, into like a full story where you have those in-between shots and the stuff that kind of paints the picture instead of just, here's a bunch of banger slackline shots.
I know. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a bunch of banger slackline shots in a row. I'm guilty of that for sure. But, it's much easier to watch a slackline video with context. When you're shooting, ask yourself, how am I going to provide context and like tell people what's going on here without actually like having to say it? If you switch between a shot of like a trick line over water and then a high line over a canyon, it's really jarring. But if you like transition with some time lapses or a little bit of establish of like walking up to the spot and then leaving the spot, then
a shot of you driving between them.
Yeah, exactly. Then it's much easier to transition between those shots, and the viewers understand better kind of what's happening.
And when I think of B-roll, I think a little bit about In the Line Without Limits movie, the big line segment. We have some sweeping drone shots and some stuff of Caleb talking with driving and other things happening. And it starts to paint that picture that this is a different scene than the previous scene.
Definitely.
And that's really important. It just makes it more coherent.
Yeah, yeah. And then it comes to the editing process. You know, once you've gone out, gotten all your footage, you come back, organize it, hopefully, on your computer. And then you start editing. And when you're editing, you're basically working off your storyboard with the footage you now have. And so you kind of sketch out in your timeline on your editing software, whether it's like Final Cut or iMovie or whatever. You know, you start from the beginning and say, how am I gonna introduce this video and how am I gonna end it, and then kind of like fill in the in between. And what you have to think about during the editing process is like the same things you asked yourself when you're storyboarding. It's like, why am I making this video? What is the story I have to tell, and what effect do I want it to have on people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you have those previous steps put together in a good way, if your storyboard's good to begin with, and then you really shoot for sequencing, you really shoot a shot thinking that these are probably a similar way that they're going to be organized when editing, then it makes editing so much easier. If you go through your camera and you just have a million shots that are random and a million B-roll that's random, the editing process is pretty tedious, and it's kind of hard to stay with your picture that you wanted to paint with your vision to begin with. But if you've been shooting for sequencing and you already have been thinking about how it's going to go together on your computer, then when you get to editing, it flows really easily. Usually you kind of just dump all your media in, you dump the sections that you want for each part of the film that you've already put together on your storyboard, and you kind of piece together some of those B-rolls in the transitions, and it's not so difficult to edit once you get that in, and then you put some music behind it, and you kind of get the transitions to hit on the beat or hit right around the beat or whatever you're trying to do, and it becomes a pretty smooth process if those previous steps are put together well.
Yeah, totally. And you know, once of course the editing is like an iterative process where you're going to make a draft and then you're going to watch it and cut it down and make changes. And I think an important thing to say there is like cut out the fluff. You know, earlier I said like it's better to have a longer story, of course. Like it's better to have a documentary than an Instagram clip, but you still want to keep people entertained. So, you know, when you're editing, watch your edit and then have someone else watch it and tell you what they think, and use that feedback from yourself and from someone else to cut back on what might be unnecessary. Because
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you want to make it interesting.
And I think it's important that you do that kind of in an iterative process. I'll go back, and when I'm editing something, I'll edit it down 2 or 3 or 4 times before I go and make it try to match up with the music perfect. Because once I match it up with the music and then I go back and try to edit out areas, I'm going to have to rematch it with the music. And same thing with those other steps of the iterative process. If I go through and I color grade everything to make each scene kind of line up with the color before the next scene, and then I go back and I edit about 5 minutes, I'm probably going to have to change some things after. So there's kind of that stepwise process of cutting it down, cutting out the fluff, like you're saying, and then maybe even shorting each clip up a little bit more to make sure you're not ending up with these long drags between scenes. And then you go back and make the music work, and then you go back and make the color work, and you watch it once or twice in between each one of those steps to make sure that you're happy with each step.
Yeah. I mean, the classic filmmaker's computer has a folder of files that is like final, right?
Yeah. It's like final edited, color grade 1, color grade 2, final color grade for YouTube, for Insta.
I can't tell you how many times
I just went back and deleted like 10 versions of all my film.
I can't tell you how many times I exported Lines Without Limits before I was happy with the final. 20 plus.
Yeah. For sure. But that's important, because if you just exported it once and you were like, it's pretty good, and you released it, you'd probably be pretty upset with a bunch of different things when watching it.
Yeah,
And it would be
totally.
less entertaining for everyone else because you didn't put as much iterative work into it.
Exactly. So I guess on that, and once your video is out, of course, then it's about media and promotion, and um, I personally think YouTube is a really good platform to post videos on, because there's a little bit more permanence on YouTube, where you can always go back and find a video that you saw, even if it was 5 years ago, really easily.
Yeah,
Whereas if you
super
think
important.
about, Instagram Live, or what is it called, Instagram TV, it's kind of harder to go back and find stuff that's been around. So
You got
I'm
to remember like who posted it specifically, which there are people I follow on Instagram that I love, and I'm like, what was that person's name? And I can't remember their name, and then the video is sort of lost, even if I might know how to search it on YouTube, and you can't find it on Instagram.
I'm definitely a fan of posting your stuff on YouTube. Um, and yeah, so that's kind of the whole process wrapped up. But I think now we can talk about just like some little tips to you as a Slackline filmmaker to make your video better on a budget. Whether it's like little pieces of gear or little advice. I think we have like a few things that have been helpful for me as a filmmaker that I'm stoked to share with you. So first one is, get yourself a cheap microphone. It's really easy to improve your video quality by improving the sound quality, and sound always has a
Absolutely.
much bigger impact than you think. This is a little lapel mic that I bought from Amazon for $20, and this is the mic I used for all of the Lines Without Limits interviews. And some other filmmakers saw it, and they asked what kind of microphone I used, and when I told them that I just used this $20 lapel mic from Amazon, they were in shock. So it doesn't take that much money to make your audio better, but it is worth getting a microphone.
Super important. Yeah.
And then of course, sound design is the natural next step for that. If you add little sound effects and ambient sounds to your video, it helps create that feeling that you're trying to go for. If I'm looking at a drone shot of a slackliner walking across a canyon in Colorado, I'm gonna probably add like a really light wind sound and then some birds chirping to create a scene that's like really peaceful and quiet as someone's walking a 400-meter high line. And I actually used some similar sound effects in Lines Without Limits. So if you go back and watch the highline section, all the sound is designed in post. None of the sound is original, pretty much in the whole film. So I'm going back and adding sound effects to like create the feeling that I want to have in the video.
Yeah, and that makes such a more accurate picture and vision of what you're seeing. Because if you imagined yourself there watching that highliner out in Colorado, you would imagine that those noises would exist. So when those noises aren't there, your brain sort of has like a hiccup. You feel like something's missing. Even if you don't recognize that it's the audio, those little things really, really help. And you can go on the other end of the spectrum and do way too much and have booms and bangs and lots of noises, and it becomes kind of crowded. But having some of those noises in there really paints like a way more accurate picture, and your brain just is so much more satisfied watching that image with a couple of those natural sounds that you would expect to be in those situations.
Totally. You want the viewer to hear the sounds but not notice that they were put in post, so you're creating a scene that's realistic, basically. And then when you're talking about camera gear, I think a cheap camera can go a long way. I don't really like making movies on my iPhone, because the iPhone lens just doesn't give you a lot of depth. But you can get a nice camera for probably cheaper than an iPhone, half the cost of an iPhone, really. For example, the Sony A6000 you can buy for under $400, and it just helps put a really nice feeling into your video. And having a DSLR, like a mirrorless camera, gives you a lot of flexibility to show depth I think, in your subject matter that you can't do with a phone. And so if you're serious about
Uh,
slackline filmmaking, it doesn't mean that you have to get a $3,000 camera to jump into it, because but I would really consider getting some sort of camera.
And I think what's important when thinking about cameras is, like you said, you don't need the most expensive camera body to start out right away.
No.
But with most brands, they have sort of a series of camera bodies where, for example, with the Sony Alpha series, like you're talking about, the Sony Alpha 6000 is only 400 or 500 bucks for the camera body. And then you can spend your money buying one or two nice pieces of glass. And really, when it comes to quality of film, I would say the glass is almost more expensive. The lenses are almost more, or not more expensive, more important than the body itself. And you can upgrade the body later on if you choose to. So if you get the Sony 6000 or whatever, you can buy one nice piece of glass that is a variable length lens that works for a lot of subjects close and far, like a 24 to 105 or something. And later on, if you want to, you can choose to upgrade the body to make that lens even have a higher quality video output.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, you think about us as highliners, especially, we're pretty willing to drop money on gear all the time. I mean, I'm sure many highliners have spent over $1,000 on their highline rig, and so for less than the price of a highline rig, you can have this awesome tool set, a camera and a lens, to be able to tell your stories. And I think, for me, storytelling in slacklining is almost as important as the slacklining itself. And that's not the case for everyone. A lot of people just really appreciate the athletic part of it and the community part of it, but I think the storytelling
being outdoors
is important, and being willing to make just a small investment in camera equipment is worth it. And like we said, you don't need the nicest stuff at all. You can get a $400 camera that's going to be able to do pretty much everything we did in Lines Without Limits.
Yeah, and speaking of cheap camera equipment, there's a lot of cheap action cams out there that, for point of view stuff, like I'm just gonna post a quick video of, oh look, this is my longest highline send with the camera. Like a GoPro is only $400, and that's a lens and a body, and I think that comes with your SD card all in one. So if you already have a computer, for $400 you can literally have everything you need to make a couple simple point of view edits. And the newer GoPros have kind of incredible quality for such a small camera. And if you buy an older GoPro, you can get one for $200 or $300, and that's, as far as camera equipment goes, that's very affordable to be able to kind of jumpstart yourself into making some sort of media.
That's absolutely true. And so good little tips on kind of your gear and filmmaking process, but and we'll kind of close out in a second. So if you have any questions before we end the stream, just go ahead and leave a comment now. But some final advice on telling a story in slacklining, and if you want to make a film in slacklining, watch a lot of other films. Watch filmmakers that you think are good and try to imitate their style. It's like a form of flattery. It's not copying at all. If you're making a film that's modeled after someone else's film, that's a really good way to do it. And
I think when watching those films, what's important to remember is kind of watch it from the perspective of noticing what they did as a filmmaker and as an editor, and not just watch it to kind of see the story. Because if I watch it and I see the story, oh, I went out and tricklined and that looks fun.
Yeah.
But if you watch it from the perspective of creating that media, you might see, oh, their subject is on the left-hand side of the frame, or they do a panning shot to do a transition, or he has a slow zoom while he's filming that shot. And all those little things add up. One transition is not much, and one zoom is not much. But after 10 minutes of all those transitions and effects, it really paints a more beautiful picture. So when you're watching those films, kind of see what other people are doing and think about it from a perspective of a filmer and not just a perspective of someone absorbing that media. And you'll pick up a lot of things that you probably didn't pick up the first couple times you watched it if you try to watch it from that perspective.
That's a really great point. I feel like I can't watch a video and experience it as a normal person anymore because I'm a filmmaker and I'm always thinking about how it was edited and how it was shot and all these different things, which is a blessing and
that's
a curse.
why I bring it up, because I'm the same way. Even when I'm watching a movie, like downstairs on my television, I'm always thinking about like, well, that shot seemed like the color maybe wasn't quite right, or like the sound was a little off, or like I don't know if I'm totally sold on the way that they shot that shot. And it's just something that, because I've been doing it for a little bit now, that I think about it a lot. But if you want to get into it, it's a really important thing to start thinking about and to try to start absorbing content in a different way that will help you when you then go make your own content.
Totally. But I think a really good way to start is if you have an idea for a film, you can almost take someone else's blueprint and copy it. Like one of my favorite filmmakers is Levi Allen, who did the Untethered documentary, and you can kind of watch his film and almost match it shot for shot with a different storyline. You know, instead of being the longest free solo ever walked, it could be like a new trickline trick that's never been done, but you can copy the structure of it.
So we have a question that almost ties into exactly what you're talking about right now. It says, what makes up a story? What is a short example of incorporating a story into a film? And so the short example that you just mentioned was the longest free solo, and that story was sort of who did it last, what was the record previously, and then what were the steps that Spencer, who was the primary subject of that film, what were the steps that he went through to then set that record? And then did he succeed right away? Did he fail this many times? And the steps up to him ending up actually breaking the record. But I think if we were to break a story up into pieces, there's the introduction of the plot, which in that case with Spencer was breaking a world record. And then there's introducing the subjects and introducing the things that are leading up to the plot. And then there's the steps involved in the plot, whatever that is, landing a new trick, breaking a world record, setting up a new high line. For setting up a new high line, it might be hiking and then climbing and then tagging and then rigging and then actually walking the line. But that's kind of where the vision board comes in. So what makes up a story? You get to ask yourself that question. You get to ask, what's the story I want to tell? And then what do I want to say makes up that story? Yeah. And then when you're filming, you can actually incorporate those different examples of what you think makes up a story into your own film. Justin, you want to add anything?
Yeah, definitely. That? So I think there are two ways to tell a story. You can tell it directly and sit people down and interview them and ask them what happened. And that's what we did with the Colorado Highline record. You know, in the Lines Without Limits, we had people talking about what was happening. But there's also an indirect story where maybe you don't have any dialogue at all and you're still telling a story, but just through visuals. And I think you see that a lot in slacklining when it comes to freestyle highlining edits or something like that, where instead of, you know, literally laying out the words of a story, you're telling the story from, you know, driving up to the crag, hiking up, setting up the line, and then doing tricks, and then showing some sort of emotion through celebration or whatever. In the highlight.
That's a great point. That's a great point. That a lot of the times the story is being told primarily or completely through the visions, the visuals of the film. And especially with, like you're saying, with those shorter edits, many times you can have a 5-minute edit, which is a lot of content with absolutely no dialogue whatsoever, and you can keep the person watching the content engaged just by telling the story with the film. And that's really common. So yeah, that's a good distinguishing point.
Totally. I think to tell a story in slacklining, you don't have to have any dialogue at all. I think slacklining is a really visual thing, but it's still really useful to storyboard ahead of time, even if you're not going to have any dialogue, to have a good
Yeah.
structure of how your video is going to lay out. And that's when B-roll comes into